Alright everybody, welcome back to We Play Games. I'm Walker, and here we are in Age of Wonders 4, about to continue our multiplayer basics playlist. Now this is going to be a video where we're going to talk about the Tier 1 tomes, which I think are really important to setting the pace of the game, and of course the pace of the development of your economy. But I do want to tell you that of course you can use these things in single player and the learnings here from multiplayer for single player and still be very strong. It's just that, you know, in single player most of what you're going to be doing is abusing the tactical AI and taking advantage of that, whereas these are going to be more specialized for playing against an intelligent opponent, against your other humans who are in the multiplayer match. And because of that, the things that you need to look for in each tome are going to be pretty meaningfully different, and the way you assess them are going to be pretty meaningfully different. So before we jump in on the tier list itself, let's talk about what you should be looking for in each tome, and the way that you should be assessing things, especially when it comes to tier 1 tomes themselves. So what are the sort of things that you want to look for in tomes broadly, and in tier 1 tomes specifically? In each tome you're going to get access to a lot of different things. You're going to get access to affinity, you're probably going to get access to a special province improvement, you're probably going to get access to a hero skill, you might get access to a summon, hopefully that summon evolves or is automatically just very powerful. You might get access to a unit enchantment, which is going to apply to all of your units, not just your racial unit. You might get access to a racial transformation, which in contrast to a unit enchantment only applies to one race worth of units, but also doesn't require an upkeep. You might get access to tactical spells, to city spells or strategic layer spells. You might get access to strategic layer spells that deal damage to enemy units or heal enemy units, and all of these things together are the things that you need to be assessing. But you should keep in mind always that I think the most important thing when it comes to your tier 1 tome is setting yourself up for success. You want to be able to create an economy that's going to grow very quickly, be very powerful, let you beat down enemy ancient wonders, and make your economy grow from there. On that note, of course, there are going to be some tomes that look really good on the surface, but because of the nature of their affinities in particular, they're going to be weighed down. So let's talk about these dimensions here that we're going to be assessing things on. S tier tomes are going to be those tomes that are almost universally useful. They have just great resources available to you no matter what you're doing in multiplayer. A tier tomes are going to be those that are generally very good, but maybe they have 1 or 2 weaknesses in them, or perhaps they're just not as ubiquitously useful as S tier tomes. B tier tomes are going to be those that are a little more narrow. Perhaps there's some serious problems in the tome, but overall they provide 1 or 2 tools that are very powerful and so are still technically playable. The C and the D tier tomes are going to be those that I would encourage you largely to avoid unless you know exactly how to use them, because these are going to be those that are generally not very good in multiplayer and really only useful in single player if you're abusing the tactical AI and how bad it is. But fortunately for us, there probably aren't going to be a lot of D tier tomes here in the tier 1 tomes. Most of these are pretty well balanced, but as we move further into the different tiers of the tomes, we'll notice that there are some tomes that are virtually unplayable, that just don't have any sort of home, and that's where the D tier tomes are going to show up. But let's kick things off by talking about our first tome here in this little list that they've provided for us, the Tome of Zeal. So the Tome of Zeal is actually one of my very favorite tomes here in game. It does a lot of stuff really well. So what does the Tome of Zeal do for us? The first thing that it does, and I think the thing that kind of like pulls it down just a little bit, is that it provides for you 2 order affinity. Broadly speaking, order affinity is not very good. I'll put a link to the Empire development down below, but there's just not a lot of payoff for order affinity. But fortunately, you do need order affinity in order to get access to the tier 3 and tier 4 and tier 5 order tomes, and some of them, like Tome of Sanctuary, are very good. And so if you're trying to set yourself up in order to take advantage of some of the later order affinity tomes, you need to get order affinity from somewhere, and Tome of Zeal is very good across the board for the rest of the stuff. It gives you access to Circle of Zealotry, which is a special project improvement that counts as a quarry. Now normally I look for research posts as the main thing that we're looking for in terms of special project improvements, or for that matter just lots of extra industry here if we can afford it. But I think Circle of Zealotry, it does actually fit a very specific niche. It gives you 10 draft per positive or negative level of alignment, and it's very possible to just alignment bomb yourself and declare war on free cities, pillage their stuff, stuff and get to pure evil very, very quickly. And if you have a special province improvement that gives you, plus 20 draft or plus 30 draft at the very beginning of the game, that is a huge upgrade in terms of your ability to crank out units. The steady stability here is basically nonsense, but another thing that you do want to look for when it comes to special province improvements, especially in the early game, is whether or not it's a unit deployment location. Because of course this means that you can spawn units outside of your capital and therefore closer to the front line, and maybe shave an entire turn or two off of the ability of those units to get to the front line and start collecting experience points quickly. And so this, I think, broadly is a pretty good province improvement. The novice hero skill here, Condemn, is situational but nice because it is a free action. Anytime you see a free action on hero skills, you should always, perk your ear up. It's free, right? Anything that's free can't be that bad. But fortunately, Condemn isn't like a ludicrously overpowered free action. In fact, it's pretty situational. It's battle magic, and broadly speaking, I don't think you need a ton of mages when it comes to Age of Wonders 4. Having one or two mage heroes can be pretty strong, simply because of the ability that they have at AoE clearing, and especially during auto battles, they can do a lot of damage with lightning evocation with just a minor dip. But Condemned is a huge bonus simply because of the -3 status resistance and the way it interacts with Legion of Zeal. So Legion of Zeal is our enchantment here for the Tome of Zeal. It's +2 spirit damage. Spirit damage is universally one of the best damage types in the game, simply because there are very few things that actually resist spirit damage, and a lot of things that are weak to it, especially if you're starting in the underground. There's just a ton of stuff in the underground that's going to be weak to spirit damage, and Legion of Zeal at +2 damage or +4 damage is actually meaningfully more powerful than any of the other enchantments we're going to see here in Tier 1. There's also access to Summon Zealot, which is the spell that you're going to be starting with if you start with the Tome of Zeal, which means unlike a lot of the other tomes, you can actually immediately start using your mana to add zealots to the board, to act as scouts, to act as, throwaway units to allow your heroes to take harder fights that they would otherwise be desperately injured in, and that's actually really important. When it comes to the setting the pace of the game in Age of Wonders 4, you want your heroes to be able to take as much experience points as possible, while also keeping as many hit points as possible. You want them to take hard fights, but not get badly damaged or, worse, die. And so having throwaway units like Zealots is actually pretty nice, simply because you can summon them, walk them into a fight, use them to actually initiate the fight, pull heroes in from the outside, save the movement points on the heroes, and then hopefully the Zealot itself just dies. But that's a very, very powerful playstyle, and I think one of the reasons that Tome of Zeal is so good. The other thing that I think really pushes Tome of Zeal up is this Fanatical Workforce ability. Now, I do want to preface this by saying Fanatical Workforce, unlike some of the other things that we're going to see here, is only 3 turns. And so if you're going to be using Fanatical Workforce to dramatically increase your production income in a city, you're going to be testing the limits of your casting points when it comes to your world map casting. And so if you're going to be going into Tome of Zeal, I do think you probably want to be playing as a Wizard King, simply so that you can keep casting Fanatical Workforce when you need to. But +60 production income in exchange for -20 food income means that Tome of Zeal is sort of unparalleled in the early game when it comes to industry production, which means that you can use this to just blitz out easy access to powerful things in your city. You can get your tier 2 upgrade on your city, and from there get access to special province improvements super duper quickly. This can help you push out your wizard tower level 1 or level 2 crazy fast. And of course, because you can move this from city to city and just, buff up the industry in particular cities, you can use this to rush out access to research really fast, and from there grow your economy a lot. Inspiring Chant and Condemnation as spells are both pretty anemic, but overall I think that Tome of Zeal is a very good tome. The only reason that I'm not going to be ranking it as an S tier here is that I think overall the Order Affinity Empire tree is pretty bad, but I think everything else about the Tome of Zeal here is fantastic. So I'm going to drop this in as an A tier tome. I think if you're trying to play around with Tome of Zeal, be aware that this is largely going to be something for a longer game because of how powerful the Zeal enchantment is if you're playing playing a longer game, and of course because of how much industry you're getting out of Fanatical Workforce, and of course the value of draft from Circle of Zealotry, I think that just is a very good, consistent overall tome, and you should be pretty happy taking it. I think on the other side of things we have the Tome of Faith. The Tome of Faith isn't inherently bad, because it does have some interesting things to it, but it's also critically missing out on a lot of the most important pieces when it comes to Tier 1 tomes. So this is another Order Affinity. We talked about Order Affinity with Zeal, but broadly speaking, not the greatest. But it does give you access to a Research Post Special Province improvement. You should look for the Research Post Special Province improvement whenever you can, simply because A, knowledge is ludicrously powerful here in Age of Wonders 4, and B, it's pretty limited. You actually can't build research posts on everything. You have to have a wondrous material or have access to a mana node in order to build a research post naturally, and so that means that some cities are going to struggle to get the 2 research posts together that you need in order to build a Scholars Guild. So anytime you see a research post when it comes to your bonuses on a tome, that should move it almost an entire letter grade up, simply because of how powerful this is. But unfortunately for the Tome of Faith, there's not a lot else here. Any sort of strategic spell is going to be good, but you really want to be looking for strategic spells that do damage to the enemy rather than healing yourself, simply because of how powerful it is in the early game when it comes to setting yourself up to do fast and easy and inexpensive from a hit point perspective clears of creeps on the map. Army heal is alright because it does help your heroes recover faster and keep them moving on the board, but the best way to, keep your heroes topped off is give them fights against enemy units that are at half HP because you hit them with a couple of blizzards. So army heal, it's okay. Mending Touch is alright because it is a free movement, and I like the fact that it's in the support line, but overall you're not going to be using your heroes too much as healing units. Rather, you're mostly going to be using them to add extra damage to your board, or just, make them into unkillable monstrosities that can eat enemy units in one turn, and healing a little bit doesn't really line up too well on that. Convent is extremely narrow and costs a lot of industry. You're not really going to be doing that. Chaplain is a healing unit that has access to some nice things here, like Healing Prayer is actually a very powerful ability, has their negative status effects removed, and 30 healing plus Bless. Like, this is a great unit when it comes to supporting one specific unit. And Spirit Blast, as I mentioned with Zeal, spirit damage is just always nice. But this is something that you have to build in your city using draft and gold, and therefore it's going to be competing against either A, letting your draft lay fallow, and therefore getting more food in your city, and therefore getting to 5 population, so you have an easier boost on your tier 2 building for your main capital. And of course, if you're building this, you're not building a different type of unit. So this is not as good as it looks on the surface. Stabs of Mending is alright, simply because some of the support units in the game are very strong. Scalds are outrageously powerful, Necromancers are very good, Fairies are very good, and this does reduce the unit upkeep, and reducing the unit upkeep on a Fairy is a meaningful amount of extra mana that you get access to. And giving them Mending Touch is also pretty nice, simply because, again, free actions are good. But it's missing the core components that I think you're looking for in a tier 1 tome. There's no summon here, there's no damage here, and overall the other stuff that it gives you access to is pretty mediocre. And on that note, because literally the only thing here that I'd be really excited to work with would be the Abbey, I think we have to rank Tome of Faith as nothing more than a C tier. If it didn't have the Abbey, it would definitely be a D tier and functionally unplayable, but giving it access to a research post is actually enough to make it playable, albeit very narrow. Alright, so up next we have the Tome of Evocation moving into the Astral Affinity. I think generally speaking, Astral Affinity is one of the strongest affinity types in the game. I think it's generally a little bit behind Shadow and Materium, but only a little bit, and the payoff for focusing in on Tome of Evocation is absolutely there, because this is huge for your knowledge economy and huge for your movement economy if you can get up to the teleportation mastery. And of course, Tome of Evocation starts you off on that pretty strong, actually, because the other stuff that you get here is very nice. Light lightning weapons gives you access to extra lightning damage on your heroes. Lightning is generally not as useful against the AI simply because they're not going to be specializing on the things that are weak to lightning damage. But in PvP, lightning damage is up there with fire damage as sort of like the second best damage type behind spirit damage, because lightning damage is extra effective against gold golems and iron golems, and both of those are going to be very ubiquitous in PvP simply because of how strong they are, what they make available to the players in question. So anytime you see lightning damage in a tome, especially because, you know, they're all going to be astral, that should perk your ears up. We also get access to the channeling tower, which, although it isn't a research post and therefore is a little worse, this is extra mana, and mana is going to be a very critical resource once you hit tier 2 tomes, because unless you're banning Tome of Amplification, you're going to be putting amplified mines on literally every single city that you have as soon as humanly possible, which is going to cost a lot of mana because you're also going to have, you know, a bunch of random summons running around. And you know, the rest of the Tome of Evocation is actually quite nice. You get access to summon lesser storm spirits, which are going to be giving you access, of course, to an evolve unit. Anytime you see here, when you mouse over it, it says at champion it evolves into something. This is going to be evolving into a tier 3 unit, and it's not just any tier 3 unit. The Storm Spirits are really good because they get access to Heavy Charge Strike, which means they can break through any sort of charge resistance. They get access to Shocking Phase, which gives them an AoE. They can smash down defenses and let your other guys, you know, just clown on whoever they want to. But the big problem for Storm Spirits is that the lesser Storm Spirit has 45 hit points, and so these things die like paper. And of course, even the evolved form is only 85 hit points and doesn't have a ranged attack. So these are very fragile units and relatively slow. 32 movement on a shock unit means that it's hard to get them onto the field without using their blitz in ability, the Shocking Phase, which of course means sacrificing the ability to use Shocking Phase to get your unit back out of combat. So lesser Storm Spirits are good. These are not the best summons in the game, but they're good. And everything else here in the tome is pretty nice. You get access to an enchantment, you get access to an astral lightning damage spell on the world map, one that even increases or decreases lightning resistance on the units you're fighting, and therefore it gives you even easier access to just doing rapid clearing on the board. And lightning focuses, this is good. Anything that is going to give you extra damage on your battle mages and support units, you should be pretty excited to see. So I think overall, the stuff that you're getting here in the Tome of Evocation is very, very nice, but I will say that you're practically never going to be building evokers. Tier 2 units across the board are very limited in their application in PvP. You can use them for a little while, but because they only gain a little bit of extra hit points when they level up and they don't get access to, you know, outrageous ways to stay alive forever, don't overemphasize these little tier 2 units that you can build along the way. They're okay, but I will say that the Tome of Evocation I think is pretty good. I think it's a little weaker overall than the Tome of Zeal, just because it doesn't give you access to the enormous amount of industry that you get access to in the Tome of Zeal, but you shouldn't be ashamed of playing the Tome of Evocation. Alright, so up next we have the Tome of Warding. The Tome of Warding is one of these things that I think people are largely underestimating simply because they're used to playing in single player, but in multiplayer, in PvP, Tome of Warding is one of the strongest tomes in the game because of one thing in particular, because of the Mark of Invulnerability. The Mark of Invulnerability is probably the single strongest spell when it comes to tier 1 tomes. There's just like absolutely nothing that can compare to becoming invulnerable and removing any sort of stun or negative status on a hero during a big combat. But of course this can also save an elemental that's in a combat by preventing the single model entity from dying and just being able to brick house people. But the rest of the tome is also pretty nice. Staves of Warding getting +2 bolstered resistance on support units is really, really good if you get access to an AoE ability on a support unit. But even if you don't, even if you're not using, you know, Tome of Revelry and Scalds or access to fairies, +2 bolstered resistance is a really, really powerful upgrade when it comes to PvP, because you should be expecting to see a lot of magic damage damage out of your enemies, and this is a very nice upgrade. And of course, magical wards as a minor race transformation that gets you +2 resistance on lightning, fire, and frost isn't exactly +2 resistance across the board, right? This isn't going to help you with blight damage, it's not going to help you with spirit damage, but this is still very, very, very good. I want to highlight that if you're trying to do PvP, then the tools here available in Tome of Warding are very nice. Phantasm Warriors are okay. They're basically our tier 2 units in terms of their combat efficiency, but they count as tier 1 units when it comes to upkeep and when it comes to like anything that only affects tier 1 units. But don't overemphasize, functional tier 2 units when it comes to combat, because these guys are just going to get rolled by high level heroes at a certain point. But these are very, very nice when someone's trying to rush you, right? If someone is trying to attack you on turn 15 and you can throw a couple of Phantasm Warriors in their face for an extremely small investment of casting points and mana, that can shift the overall scope of combat pretty dramatically. And the bolstering support ability isn't even bad. Like, this doesn't dramatically increase your combat efficiency, but if you can get bolstering support on one hero who has access to mass rejuvenation, that's a colossal swap when it comes to who is in charge of the combat field. So between all the different spells being nice and the fact that I'm a big fan of Astral Affinity generally, I think Tome of Warding is a pretty easy S tier here. You just need to know how to use it. Alright, so up next we have the Tome of Roots. The Tome of Roots is something that I think got like way too much appreciation when the game first came out, simply because of the power of Vine Prison against the tactical AI, but that was more of a reflection on the tactical AI than it was a reflection of Tome of Roots itself. When you're playing against an intelligent enemy like another human, you can't expect Vine Prison to essentially kill one unit the way that it does against the tactical AI, or for that matter kill multiple units, because everybody in a tactical AI battle just spends all the time clearing vines. But fortunately the Tome of Roots does have some other tools. You get access to a summon here that actually does evolve, and this being a skirmisher unit, it means that it's going to be staying alive a little easier, because the AI does handle skirmisher units a little better than the other unit types, and so these things evolve a little more reliably. And importantly, these are going to evolve into Entwined Protectors, which are just insanely durable units. 7 defense, 3 resistance. It counts as a plant and therefore is going to get access to a little bit of lightning resistance, which generally that's pretty good because lightning is generally pretty good. And of course Healing Sap was just a ludicrous defensive support unit, and so this is a very, very nice summon. You should definitely highlight that as, I think, the real underline for Tome of Roots, not Vine Prison. But unfortunately for Tome of Roots, Summon Entwined Thrall can't carry it all on its own, and the enchantments that you get access to here, because they do blight damage, are a little weaker than they would be overall. One of the things that happens in PvP in Age of Wonders 4 is that, of course, A, heroes kind of become the dominant force on the battlefield, and B, outside of heroes, you're mostly going to be using things that are hopefully immune to morale damage, either because they're a golem or because they're undead, and golems and undeads are both resistant to blight damage. And so anytime you see blight damage on a tome, you should just be aware that it's not really what you're looking for. It's almost a downgrade, except against very particular enemies. Healing Roots is okay. This is like a fine tactical spell in the very beginning of the game, because it is going to help your AI keep units alive, but unfortunately the AI is not great at casting spells in auto combat, and so don't overemphasize the value of any individual tactical spell. Rather look for strategic spells, and there isn't one here for Tome of Roots. And the Herbalist Special Province Improvement, although it does give you access to extra food and mana, because it asks you to have access to swamps or potentially forests, which is of course going to be a bigger payout. I think that the economic side here for Tome of Roots is pretty limited. Really the best thing about this tome by a pretty meaningful margin are the Entwined Thralls, who are very good, but there just isn't a lot else here that I'd be excited to be playing around with. As a consequence of that, because it's really just the one unit that I'm excited to be using here, I'm going to rank this roughly on par with the Tome of Faith. I think it's a little better than the Tome of Faith, just because I really do think Entwined Thralls are that good, especially because auto combat does use skirmish units very well, or at least it doesn't let them die as frequently, and therefore they evolve a little more consistently. But there's not a lot else in the tome that you should be excited about. Up next we have the Tome of Beasts. So the Tome of Beasts is sort of of like the Tome of Roots in that you get access to an insanely powerful summon, but unlike the Tome of Roots, a lot of the other stuff that you get access to here is just great. So Mark as Prey, this is a tactical spell, so generally speaking, you're not going to be getting as much value out of this as you'd expect, unless you get into an early manual combat. But if you get into an early manual combat, Distracted is basically kill one unit if you can position the rest of your units around it very well, and this spell is almost free in terms of mana. And so if you're taking Tome of Beasts, just be aware that this is a rush tome, but fortunately, Nature Affinity is sort of a rush affinity anyway, and so this plays insanely well if your goal is to just kill somebody ASAP, either because you're on teams or because you're managing your grievances really well. The rest of the tome is also really good. Summon Wild Animal is just disgusting because it gives you access to a random selection of animals that can be summoned, including animals that can be summoned that evolve into tier 4 animals. You can see here you can summon this hunter spider as one of the potential things that you can summon, and this thing evolves into a tier 4 unit, the Hunter Spider Matriarch. You can also do the same thing with the Ice Spider evolving to the Ice Spider Matriarch or whatever, and these units are just ridiculous. You can get access to these also crazy early if you move into being a champion. Generally speaking, you don't want to be champions because they are rough in the mid to late game, but if you're trying to do a rush and you're trying to get good value out of it, getting extra experience points on all of your units, not just your racial units, the way Adaptable plays out, that's generally the way you're going to be going, and getting access to tier 4 units out of a spell that you can get access to on your tier 1 is really good. And the rest of the tome is also nice. Animal Kinship is good, 10% extra damage is a solid upgrade, especially because you're probably going to be picking one of the mounted picks when it comes to your body type. Wild Speaker is great because this lets you summon extra units and unleash the beast on your, tier 4 unit that you evolved pretty quickly. Call of the Wild can be good if you have enough animals on the field. Wildlife Sanctuary gives you access to production of other animal units and therefore can take the randomness away from summoning wild animals. You're not going to be able to get access to the tier 4 units a little as easily with the Wildlife Sanctuary, but that doesn't matter, because if you get access to one of the other spiders here, like Dread Spider Hatchlings, these still evolve into tier 3 units, and critically, these are tier 3 units that can also spawn more units, and the spawned units, anything that you summon onto the battlefield in battle, isn't actually going to hurt your morale when they die, and so getting access to even more units, again, rush. You're just getting as much value as quickly as possible, as early as possible with the Tome of Beasts. It does have economic problems in that, like, basically the only thing here that's economy is Wildlife Sanctuary, which is only extra food out of a forester. But you know what? Foresters are very important when it comes to the game. You need foresters in order to build your scholar guild in whatever cities you're working on. And so just being aware that foresters and quarries are a little weaker than research posts, but I would say around the same strength as a conduit, honestly, means that I actually really like the Tome of Beasts. Even the pack leader ability is really good, right? Anything that gets you flanker, this plus Mark as Prey, just means you're just gonna get a ridiculous amount of damage out of the Tome of Beasts. Just be aware that because Nature Affinity is basically pure rush, that if you're taking Tome of Beasts, you're probably aiming to just attack people ASAP. But, if you're willing to do that, I think that the Tome of Beasts is honestly better than the Tome of Evocation. Tome of Evocation might even just be a B tier, because like the summon for Tome of Evocation is just so unbelievably squishy, and the Tome of Warding is so unbelievably good, and you probably don't want to take 2 tomes of the exact same affinity. So yeah, we're just gonna move the Tome of Evocation down and slot the Tome of Beasts in here. So up next we have the Tome of Souls. The Tome of Souls is going to be the first tome here in the Shadow Affinities that give you access to souls. So souls you're going to get from killing enemy units. You can also sometimes get them from special events, but broadly speaking, souls are going to be useful for A, as it says here, producing undead units, B, casting certain shadow spells, but C, and not mentioned here, is that you can actually use souls to bring city ruins back from the dead. You can invest souls into a city that someone, maybe you, has razed to the ground, and therefore you can use souls to sort of supplement your Imperium economy. Anything you can do in Age of Wonders 4 that lets you supplement or cheat on your Imperium economy should immediately draw your attention, especially if it's something you can do early to cheat on or expand your Imperium economy, because that is just a really, really big upgrade in terms of your economic benefit. I would say that actually, in terms of overall economic influence on the development of Age of Wonders 4, the Tome of Souls is probably the single strongest tome in the game, but unfortunately for the Tome of Souls, the rest of the tome isn't quite as good, and that draws the whole package down a little bit. And of course it is competing against, broadly speaking, other very, very, very powerful tomes. But, you know, the tools that are here are good. You're going to be gaining access to Bone Golem, which lets you take 2 skeleton units, fuse them together, and create a nice tier 2 unit that can perform pretty well in auto combat. Getting access to Consume Corpse means that the Bone Golem is going to stay alive a little better, but also critically, Bone Golems are pretty good when it comes to actual early game PvP, simply because of the Consume Corpse ability, giving you the ability to deny any sort of enemy who's trying to come back from the dead. If they have a Phoenix or whatever, Consume Corpse is a very, very messed up ability and can dramatically change the outcome here. But unfortunately, Bone Golem don't have a heavy charge strike, just a regular charge strike, therefore they're not going to be breaking through charge resistance. Soul Overflow is probably like the best part of the tome when it comes to things that aren't just, you know, the raw economic efficiency of souls, because this is a friendly unit in 1 hex radius, getting their negative status removed, healed, and strengthened. So this combination here of Soul's Overflow and the Soul's ability is kind of like most of what you're getting here in this package. Soulbinders is nice. You know, this is something that's going to get you a little bit of extra damage on your battle mages and support units, but nothing too crazy. Same with Soul Collectors here themselves. But overall, just like the package for Tome of Souls, it's mostly just how much do you evaluate souls and Soul Overflow, and for that matter, how much do you need to get souls going super duper early. The earlier you can get souls, the more that you can use them to supplement for Imperium, and so that's like the thing that pulls Tome of Souls up, but they don't get access to a summon. The ability to build skeletons in your cities is nice, but it does mean, of course, that you're not going to be able to let your draft lay fallow and therefore get food out of it. So I think the Tome of Souls are overall, it's okay. It's got an amazing headliner, a really, really powerful single spell here for tactical combat, and then just sort of like a bunch of mediocre stuff. And I think the combination of those things means that this really can't be assessed as being any higher than B tier. I think if you really want to juice it and use the souls as Imperium and get this as a very early tome, you absolutely can. Just be careful, because you are missing out on some pretty meaningful upgrades when it comes to the economic efficiency you can get out of summons and evolutionary units and the like. So up next we have the Tome of Cryomancy. The Tome of Cryomancy is kind of up there with the Tome of Warding as one of the single best tier 1 tomes in the game. That doesn't mean that you have to take both of those together. Obviously, you can do a lot of different things when it comes to doing your build in Age of Wonders 4, but just this ticks all of the boxes for me. A, it gives you access to an evolutionary unit. You can see here that this the Lesser Snow Spirit evolves into a Snow Spirit whenever it reaches the champion rank, but this is, as I mentioned with the Entwined Thrall, this is a skirmisher unit, and therefore it's going to survive a lot better when it comes to the auto battle. And Snow Spirits are just gross. These things are disgusting. They have 40 movement and therefore a lot easier to move around on the field, but they also have swift and slippery, so they can just move around anyone whenever they want to. There's no limits to where your Snow Spirits can move once they're there. Freezing Phase, giving access to an ability to freeze stuff, is nice, but Freezing Burst, giving a 90% chance to inflict Frozen, which is a functional stun, and if it's unsuccessful, gives you access to Slowed, which means that the enemy can't do retaliation attacks. This is just a bananas ability, and of course you're getting a mixed combat damage, even on the Lesser Snow Spirit itself, right? This is a much weaker overall Freezing Burst than the Evolved form, because it's only a 30% chance, but again, if unsuccessful, inflict Slowed. That's the text you're looking for if you're trying to get some sort of real value, and the rest of the package is fantastic. You get access to a research post, which is a great special project improvement to be looking looking for. You get access to extra damage on your heroes, and this is a good damage type, not the top tier damage type, right? We're not looking at spirit or fire or lightning, so you're not going to be exploiting weaknesses that much, but you're also not going to be finding too many things that are resisting you. And so this is just sort of like a nice little transformation of some physical damage into some magical damage to get around a little bit of very high bulk defense units. And then of course you got your enchantments, and those are in the same spot as the frost weapons themselves. These things are largely not going to be doing tons of extra damage, but they're also not going to be resisting a lot. Blizzard is disgusting. This is up there with the Tome of Evocation in terms of like one of the best strategic layer spells that you can get access to in the early game, because this is extra damage on the units in a stack, therefore allowing your heroes or, you know, heroes plus to take much more dangerous fights than they would be naturally allowed to do. And -3 status resistance means that you have functionally dramatically increased the chance on your lesser snow spirits to be able to freeze things, and it means that your evolved snow spirits, if there are any of them running around, basically auto freeze if you've blizzarded the enemy. And even if you're not doing that and you're just doing a manual combat early on, Ice Coffin gives you a 90% chance of becoming frozen and slowed. And this, although it is, you know, a tactical spell and you're not getting access to other stuff here, this is a great spell too. It's just all of this stuff here is really good, except kind of the White Witch. Again, broadly speaking, tier 2 units are pretty yawnable, except in very, very narrow rush effects. But that's okay. You don't need everything in a tome to be great, and basically everything else here in this Tome of Cryomancy is fantastic. And important to note that because there are 2 unit enchantments here, we didn't talk about this in the Tome of Roots, but anytime you see 2 unit enchantments in a tome, you should immediately think, does this work well with runesmiths? Not that runesmiths is necessarily like the best society pick, but it's pretty good, and anything you can do to leverage that makes you even stronger. But I think because there's like literally basically no misses except for the White Witch, but just don't research that. I think the Tome of Cryomancy is probably, if it's not the single best tier 1 tome, then it's tied with Tome of Warding for the single best, simply because it's very, very difficult to find any sort of misses out of it. The biggest complaint I can leverage against it is that it doesn't do a lot for your economy, but getting access to a research post is actually a very, very big deal. And so yeah, Cryomancy is an S tier. There's no way around it. So up next we have the Tome of Pyromancy. The Tome of Pyromancy is in sort of a weird spot simply because I'm not the biggest fan of Chaos Affinity. There are a couple of tomes, specifically Revelry and Devastation, that I think are very, very good and a great reason to have a lot of Chaos Affinity running around. But the Empire tree for Chaos, for Watcher at least, is just like front loaded with basically skippable nonsense and doesn't really get good until you start getting into the later parts of the Chaos tree. And so that should naturally bring any of the Chaos tomes down. But fortunately, the Tome of Pyromancy is pretty good on the rest of the front. You get access to the Magma Spirits. Magma Spirits evolve into a full Magma Spirit here, which is pretty different from the other elementals, because unlike the other elementals, which warp in and then deal damage, the elemental here deals damage and then leaves. But that's actually really good, of course, because this is a battle mage, and so you don't want to be in melee combat. You want to get out of melee combat. And the Vengeful Flames ability protects you from melee attacks. Incinerate is a nice little AoE that you get access to on your battle mage from the Summon Lesser Magma Spirit. And this is just a nice, very consistent ability across the board, a great summon. And you get access to 2 really nice unit enchantments, which again, that's a little bit better if you're going to be looking around for something that utilizes runesmiths, which is a pretty nice pick. This other spells here are not as great, and I don't think you're going to be taking Pyromancer basically ever, given that Magma Spirits do basically the same thing, but much, much better. But you do get access to a forestry, and it's also not just a regular forestry, it's a forestry that's going to get you tons of extra mana. And anytime you see a special province improvement that generates something that's different from what it normally generates, that should draw your attention, because that's something where you have flexibility in terms of the production of those tiles, and of course Ritual Pyre, because this can be built somewhere that doesn't have a forest allows you to hit the 2 foresters that you want in order to build your scholars guilds, even on cities where they don't have normal access to the 2 forests. So this is, I think, overall, oh, and of course searing weapons is pretty good. And as I mentioned, fire damage just across the board is a pretty solid damage type. It scales very well into the mid game because you're going to be encountering a lot of people who are taking Whiteborn, just so that way they have the morale resistance, so that way your heroes can't just, you know, cause the entire army to collapse by killing a couple of units. So the stuff here in Pyromancy, I think if it was just a different affinity, or if the affinity tree for Chaos were a little better, then Pyromancy would probably be an A tier. But because Chaos affinity is so bad, and because the overall package doesn't provide too much in terms of economy other than giving you access to Ritual Pyre, I do think that pulls Pyromancy down. But you shouldn't be ashamed of taking Pyromancy. I think Pyromancy is probably a pretty good B tier. I think because the Tome of Souls gives you access to Imperium, it's probably a little better, but I don't know. The summon here for Pyromancy is actually very nice, and I'm a big fan of doing fire damage, just because it does do extra damage against some of the most powerful and ubiquitous unit types. So yeah, I think B tier is probably alright for Tome of Pyromancy, which of course brings us to one of the other, like, fundamentally misunderstood tomes here for PvP. We have Tome of the Horde. So in PvE and playing against the AI, Tome of the Horde is okay. You know, you get access to Summon Irregulars, which lets you summon tier 1 units to scout things. You get access to this little nice bonus that makes your tier 1 units a little better. But just in PvP, you're not going to be able to specialize a lot in tier 1 units, because if you bring a bunch of tier 1 units to a fight, you're going to lose that fight against a human every single time. And so the Tome of the Horde is like basically rush or die, and unfortunately doesn't offer a whole lot beyond that. In some ways, the Tome of the Horde is literally just the Tome of the Spawnkin, because it does give you evasion on your heroes, and that's okay. And Houndmasters do technically summon another unit, but I think this is a tome that was kind of nerfed because people were seeing how well it performed against the AI without thinking about the context in which it was performing well against the AI. It was performing well against the AI because the AI was bad, not because the Tome of the Horde was good. And if you're trying to play PvP, you need to take things that are good against intelligent enemies, and this is not it. Mob Camp is alright. I mean, getting access to a unit deployment location I think is pretty good, but the rest of the text there is pretty blank. Like, the best thing that you're getting out of it, I guess, is the extra food. But Tome of the Horde is bad. This is a very bad tome now, especially after the nerfs to Houndmasters, but even prior to that, this was not an important tome when it came to PvP, and because it's been so meaningfully nerfed, I think actually this might be our first D tier tome here. This is just not playable. If you try to use this in PvP, you're really hurting your own win percentages, because these things don't evolve, right? You're not summoning an elemental that's going to evolve into something nice. Houndmasters have 40 hit points and they get killed like crazy. Spawnkin is okay, but also means that the enemies can do a lot of damage reduction on you by just dealing damage to your units. Blaze of the Horde functionally doesn't do a lot now that this has been nerfed meaningfully. There's just nothing here that you should really be excited about. Even Battle Seeker training is extremely narrow. It's okay if you have a bunch of tier 1 units that you want to evolve, but there are other tomes that do the same thing better. Costs in Tome of Evolution. So yeah, I think Tome of the Horde is just a D. I can't imagine ever wanting to take this tome except in a team or a 1v1 scenario where you need to kill somebody as quickly as possible. Yeah, Tome of the Horde. Sorry, buddy. This is really a single player only tome. It's almost actively bad to your win percentage to take Tome of the Horde. All right, let's talk about the Tome of Rock. So the Tome of Rock benefits pretty enormously, I think, from having access to Materium Affinity, which I think is across the board one of the best affinities in the game right now. The Empire development tree for Materium basically is like all hits. There are only a couple of things that are skippable, and therefore anything you can get Materium Affinity from in terms of your tomes isn't just giving you access to this stuff here, but also critically access to things in the development tree itself. Getting Military Engineering Engineering early is a huge upgrade, and probably pushes Tome of the Rock up almost a full letter grade all on its own. Unfortunately for Tome of the Rock, there are some issues. Central Quarry is very good. I wish though that the encyclopedia showed you the cost of these buildings, because Central Quarry is also really expensive when it comes to actually building it. If it produced this amount of production and was available like consistently across the board at the same cost as the builders quarters for Industrious, this would probably be a full letter grade higher, simply because, you know, being able to build a bunch of stuff really quickly is a way to make it so you can actually build the infrastructure to outscale your opponent. Generally, you're not going to be building like pretty marginal things in your cities. You're just going to be mostly focusing in on how do you grow your cities to where you can get your knowledge going as quickly as possible, so that way you can get higher tomes as quickly as possible. But if you can get a little production along the way, that can be nice. It's just that the Central Quarry is very expensive, and unfortunately Obsidian Weaponry, the hero skill here, is practically nonsense. A 60% chance to inflict bleeding, which deals physical damage and therefore is resisted by defense, isn't great, and it also doesn't work on ethereal or undead units. So this is a pretty marginal ability when it comes to what you're looking for over here. You do though get access to Earthkin, which is pretty good. You know, extra defense on your heroes and your racial units, although racial units are going to be floating around in terms of how much you're going to be using them. Kind of depends on what your build looks like. But, you know, +1 defense on your heroes isn't bad. You also get access to Summon Lesser Stone Spirit, which any sort of summon that can evolve, and this evolves into an incredibly beefy shield unit, is pretty nice. Like, you should not be ashamed to have a Stone Spirit in your army when you're fighting people because of how well these things perform. But the gargoyles, I think, are also really good just in terms of the way they operate in combat. It doesn't show you here, but they have a defense skill that actually heals them while they're marching around the battlefield. But of course, because these gargoyles do not evolve, they're kind of limited in their ability. They're a tier 2 unit, and the same way it is with all the other tier 2 units that do not evolve, don't overemphasize gargoyles, and you have to build them in your cities. But they do build with a combination of gold and mana, which is interesting. And then the other stuff that they have here, you know, Stone Skin, this is alright. This is a meaningful increase to the survivability of the units in question, and this thing does do a reasonable amount of damage. But the biggest issue I see here with Tome of Rock is just what it is comparing against. This is all physical damage stuff, and physical damage is pretty quickly diminishing returns in the game when it comes to Age of Wonders 4, because people are just going to get a lot of defense naturally on a lot of their units as they build, you know, higher tier units as they grow their economy. And so that really does hold the Tome of the Rock down. I think that if the Central Quarry was just less expensive and Obsidian Weaponry were somehow, you know, better, like if this were a 90% chance of inflicting bleeding, then I think that it would probably be nice. But I think that Tome of the Rock, it's fundamentally a very vanilla tome. Don't be ashamed to take Tome of Rock, but don't be excited to take it either. I think with that description, this has got to be either bottom of B or top of C tier. I think it's probably top of C tier, because it doesn't do a lot in terms of increasing your damage, and that is very important, especially if you're going to be increasing damage for your heroes. So yeah, Tome of Rock, sorry friend, I think you're a top of C tier. Don't be ashamed if you play with Tome of Rock, but I don't think it's that great. On the other side of things, we have the Tome of Enchantment. So the Tome of Enchantment, again, it's a Materium affinity. This is very powerful and really gets things going for you. But unlike the Tome of Rock, which seems to mostly just be specializing in physical damage and trying to deal with physical damage, Tome of Enchantment is just crazy messed up across the board. You get access to Runecarver's Camp, which is another quarry, but unlike the other quarry, which is really expensive in terms of its industry cost, Runecarver's Camp is pretty cheap, and it gets you 15 draft. And anytime you get different resources, that's usually something that you should pay attention to. Same with a unit deployment location, and this critically gives you extra mana per adjacent quarry. I think Runecarver's Camp across the board is just a pretty nice little province improvement that you can pick up. And Sundering Strikes is good. Demolisher means that you can use your heroes a lot more effectively when it comes to siege weapons. And of course, inflicting Sundering defense, I think overall is going to give you more bang for your buck than inflicting bleeding, simply because of the nature and pace of combat in Age of Wonders 4. And the spells here are also really good. Sundering Blades is a great little ability. This means, of course, that now all of your units can just start mulching through enemy walls in a siege if you so desire. And even if you're not fighting in a siege, Sundered Defense reducing status resistance is a huge deal. But of course, the Seeker's Arrow, this is +1 range, which is a very, very nice ability if you can find some high-level ranged or skirmisher units. Spelled Tempered Shield gives you extra resistance, which is huge. Resistance very quickly becomes more important than defense, so anytime you see resistance in the board, that should draw your attention. And this Spell Tempered Shield also gets you resistance on all of your adjacent units. And unfortunately for the Tome of Enchantment, the unit that they start with here, the Copper Golem, is a polearm unit, therefore doesn't take advantage of Spell Tempered Shields. And unfortunately, similarly for the Tome of Enchantment, Copper Golems, the AI, the tactical AI, if you're using auto combat, which you're gonna need to use in PvP except for against other humans, Copper Golems have a tendency to just rush ahead of everybody else and then die. And so you're gonna see Copper Golems in armies that really should not be dying because of the nature of the AI right now. But if they don't, they evolve into Iron Golems, and Iron Golems are ludicrous. So let's just show off really quickly why Iron Golems are so disgusting. Iron Golems, 1, are crazy beefy with 95 hit points, 7 defense, 2 resistance, but they also get Protective Wall, which is probably the single best defensive mode in the game that you can find access to. You also get Siege Breaker, which lets these things just chew through enemy walls very quickly, and I think most importantly, Status Effect Immunity and Status Effect Immunity Morale. These things, even in the mid to late game against, enemy hero stacks, unless they're literally running 18 heroes or a bunch of heroes and tier 4, tier 5 units, Iron Golems really can hold their own because of these status effect immunities and morale immunities. You can bring them to basically any fight, and because they're shield units, they do benefit from Spell Tempered Shields. So all you need to do in order to get great value out of Spell Tempered Shields, of course, is keep your Copper Golems alive. My general recommendation for ways to do that is to just take the first 4 experience points and assume that you're only going to be getting those from experienced leaders, or just from summoning a Copper Golem and hoping it stays alive. These things do die really, really fast though, and that kind of brings the overall Tome of Enchantment down. Once the tactical AI gets better, I think that this will help out the Tome of Enchantment. But we haven't even talked about, I think, the best part of the Tome of Enchantment overall, which is Awakened Tools. Awakened Tools gets you +20 production, +20 draft, all for the measly cost of -10 city stability, and you can put this on every single city that you have. So this is, if you have 3 cities, this single spell is going to be +60 production, +60 draft over the course of your entire empire for 1 tier 1 spell that you research. And unlike Fanatical Workforce in Zeal, you don't have to keep casting this over and over again, because this is a set it and forget it enchantment spell. So yeah, the Tome of Enchantment, I think if the AI were better at keeping Copper Golems alive, then I think this would be a pretty easy S tier, because there's really absolutely no misses here. But the fact that the AI does just tend to throw your Copper Golems away in the early game pulls these guys down. But I think, kind of no matter what, this is either the very top of the A tier or the very bottom of the S tier. And once the AI gets better and understands not to rush the Copper Golems ahead of all of your other units and then just get got by the enemy AI, I think this is alright being an A tier. And that brings us to the Tome of Evolution. Now, the Tome of Evolution is only available if you have the Dragon Dawn DLC, but if you have it, then you can play around with that and the Tome of Dragons and the Dragon Lord in particular. But the Tome of Evolution has been nerfed pretty meaningfully, and that is going to be reflected here in this tier list. So the Tome of Evolution, first thing, of course, is Nature Affinity and Chaos Affinity. I'm not a huge fan of either of those, but if you're going to be doing them, getting them early and rushing through them is a pretty nice little upgrade. But the bonus here you get for your heroes is actually pretty good. This is going to keep your evolutionary units alive way more consistently, which is important because one of the nerfs that the Tome took is that no longer as the Rapid Evolution enchantment, give your units Resurgence. Now they only get Slip Away. Slip Away isn't bad, it's actually really good in like actual manual battles against the other human players here in your PvP or multiplayer or whatever, but it's meaningfully worse than Resurgence when it comes to the way your auto battles work, and this is a pretty meaningful hit to the power of the tome. Similarly, the Draconic Vitality got nerfed pretty badly because now it caps on your heroes. It used to just be like basically an infinite amount of hit points to your heroes and was pretty broken. I think nerfing it down to capping at 5 levels for your heroes, if I remember correctly, is good, but it was a pretty big blow to the overall strength of the Tome of Evolution, because now your heroes aren't suddenly immortal simply because you took one tier 1 tome. The other parts of the package aren't bad. Slither Hatchlings are a really good evolutionary unit. They're crazy fast, they stick around, and of course they evolve into Slithers, which are disgusting skirmisher units. Skirmisher units generally, as I mentioned with the Snow Spirits, are very, very good at being used in auto battle, but also great in actual battle, and Slithers are very tough to pin down and to kill, and of course if you try to kill them and you don't get anywhere, Draconic Rage means the Slithers can really mess you up. Youthful Rejuvenation is like a fine tactical battle spell, and summon Wyvern Fledgling is pretty nice. The Wyvern Fledglings, of course, also evolve into Wyverns. The only issue with Wyvern Fledgling, of course, is that these are wildly different in terms of their overall value, but the nice thing, of course, is that no matter which one you get here, they're not bad. It's just that I think broadly speaking, the Frost Wyvern is the best one because it does actually get a ranged ability here in Freezing Burst, whereas the other ones are just like beat sticks. But you know, at least they're beat sticks that do a good elemental damage type. But I think because the Rapid Evolution enchantment got nerfed so badly, and because these are not like the affinities that I'm looking for, and generally speaking, although Slither Hatchlings are quite nice, they aren't summonable. You have to build these with actual draft. I think that means that the Tome of Evolution really has been brought down since over the course of the Watcher patch and the release since Dragon Dawn DLC. I like the fact that this isn't a pay-to-win tome anymore, but I wish it were just like a little better across the board. I'm not sure exactly how they could do that. Maybe getting access to, you know, like a special province improvement would be nice for Tome of Evolution, just to make the DLC a little spicier. But I think because of the problems with the Tome of Evolution and the nerfs it's taken over time, I think it's probably the bottom of the B tier. I can't imagine taking Tome of Evolution and some of these weaker tomes to try to build myself out. Now that said, before we close out here, even though this is the distribution that I have, feel free to A, disagree with me, but B, also feel free to mix and match. You know, just because these two are, I think generally speaking, a lot stronger than some of the other tomes here, doesn't mean that you can't take, like, you know, Tome of the Rock and something else, right? You can combine higher tier and lower tier tomes together to get some really good and interesting value. Like, one thing that I'm looking forward to doing in the future is trying out Dark with Tome of Enchantment and Tome of Zeal to see if those two things together can give me enough industry to really make use of Dark, which has a very high knowledge cap naturally, but also has very low industry naturally. And so using your tomes not only to get affinities, not only to get spells, but also to fix particular holes in your build, I think is probably the best way to approach any sort of tier list when it comes to tomes. That said, don't take Tome of Horde. It's bad. Don't do this. It's not good. All right, that's Walker. Take care.